my name is Jason Henderson. I am the co-publisher with Yo at Castlebridge Media, and we're here to discuss a brand new anthology that we have out today. This is the Castle of Horror Anthology, Volume 8, Thinly Veiled, the 80s. And what's significant about that, you can actually see the cover glowing blue behind me. Cover was designed, of course, by co-publisher Yo. What's significant about this is the second collection that we have done in a series that we call Thinly Veiled. And the idea is we put out a call to the writers and say, pick something from whatever it is. Last time it was the 70s, this time it's the 80s. In the future, it might be Saturday morning cartoons. We don't know yet, but we say, pick something recognizable in that arena and thinly veil it, meaning change the names, what have you. And so that's what we've got. We're going to discuss with each of the authors who are with us today the different stories that they've done, and they can explain what they've ended up borrowing from. So I'm just going to go in the order of the list that I have in front of me, because on my Zoom, I'm not going to be able to pick you any other way. So I'm going to start out by calling on Charles Rutledge to talk about his story, The Shadow over Waikiki. And by the way, after this, we'll do questions. So
your lighting is much better tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, Mr. Charles, go for it.
Yes, sir. Well, it's kind of funny because when you initially told me we were going to do the 80s, I emailed you back and said, I'm going to do Magnum P.I. versus Cthulhu. And you said, do you have a plot for that? I was like, yes, I do. So,
yeah.
So I never thought of anything else. That was my immediate idea. That was absolutely my favorite television show in the 80s. And I've watched it in reruns for years. And I watched about 20 episodes as I was writing the story to get back in the feel. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to write an actual horror story. So it's not a parody or even really a pastiche. It just has some of the elements of the TV show, but the Lovecraftian horror element is very real. It's not a happy-go-lucky story.
That's wonderful. The funny thing is, reading it, it really did feel like a classic detective story that just happened to take place on Waikiki. And but if you knew the Magnum universe, so that's really kind of what I love about Thinly Veiled, is how in the end you're just using these recognizable plots as a jumping off point, and then you can kind of do in the end you do something that stands up by itself.
Because I was thinking sort of in terms of Raymond Chandler and that sort of thing as I wrote it, because that's what I read. I'm primarily a crime writer who just happens to like monsters. So this was right up my alley. It was like, okay, I'm going to go with Magnum. And, I tried to drop in references to the Ferrari, but then I changed. I think I made the Dobermans into German Shepherds. And,
Yeah.
instead of Thomas Magnum, we had Amos Morgan. But I did a lot of research on like where the actual house they used for Robin Masters' estate was, and put it in the right place. The street names and everything are correct. And in fact, everything in there is a real place. So I tried to set it very much in that area. And interestingly enough, 87 was the year I visited Hawaii.
Oh.
So I said it the year I was there.
Yeah, it's the Hawaii of your memory. That's
exactly,
really
and some stuff in there doesn't exist anymore. The big international marketplace, which you see in the episode that has Frank Sinatra in it, very prominently featured, that's long gone. But my brother and I were there, and we walked all over it. I had a Detroit Tigers cap. It was great.
Wow. Was the Geodesic Dome that was in Waikiki, was that still there in the 80s? I'm trying to.
I'm not sure.
Hang on. Well, very cool. All right. We will definitely discuss more when we come around, because I'd love to talk about like how you came to these stories. But for you, actually, Charles, it sounds like coming to it was kind of deliberate. It was like 80s, I'm definitely doing Magnum.
Very much. As soon as you said it, it was Magnum P.I. versus Cthulhu.
Awesome. Princess Alethea Kontis, I know that you are here, And your story was called The Way of the Restless. And so the first thing I have to know is, did you actually watch soap operas in the 80s? Like, was that personal to you, or did you just decide to do that?
The Young and the Restless is incredibly personal to me. My mother watched it religiously in the 80s, and Nadia's theme, which is the theme to Young and the Restless, I knew if I heard that, it was time for me to take a nap. So even when I was a kid, it was ingrained. My big sister got married, I think I was 5 or 6, and Endless Love was her wedding song, which Michael Damian sang and made very famous. So Young and the Restless, the 80s was really the heyday of that. But later, as I grew older, my Aunt Ernestine Mercer, she was an actress and she played on Young and the Restless, and she had the most fun. Like every conversation we had, she talked about how fun it was to be on the Young and the Restless. It was just the best time of her life. So that particular soap opera is very, very personal to me. So
before you go on, I just want to say that Nadia's theme, I remember it so distinctly from my own childhood, and hearing that and seeing that. I mean, I wasn't interested in The Young and the Restless as a 5-year-old, but boy, do I remember that theme and that big sweeping Y&R. So what's your story about? What's The Way of the Restless?
Well, back when I wrote more science fiction, I don't write as much anymore. But every so often I like to dip my toe in, and I was having a conversation with someone about cloning. And I said, oh, well, if cloning was ever made legal, the first people to jump on that would be the soap opera people, because Nikki and Victor could break up and make up for the rest of time.
Yeah.
Forever. And then the second people to jump on that bandwagon would be every woman who ever wanted to have Elvis's baby.
Oh. Yeah.
So I combined those two and sort of made this where it's, other folks have the really horrible horror. Mine is the happy feel good heist of Elvis in the future. It's an adventure, and I absolutely love it, and came out of the insanity of my brain.
What I thought was really funny about this story was the cursing, and there was this knowing sort of parody thing where the main character is always cursing, and then it gives an explanation of what language he's cursing in, and it was so like self-conscious and like, this is how we do science fiction around here. I mean, that was very cool. And yeah, and I love that actually, if you watch Days of Our Lives today, I think they are practicing cloning, because some of those actors have been on that show, I swear, for like 50 years and don't appear to have changed.
Eric Draven is still playing Victor on Young and the Restless to this
Goodness
day.
gracious.
It's insane.
Is he wow, that's amazing. No, I know that guy from, yeah, I mean, he was around in the 60s. You see, and he looks fantastic. Thank you very, very much. Incher Yo, you wrote a story called The Dead Die Hard, and the way I described this is it's the events of Die Hard getting interrupted by zombies. And but before you go into that, you might explain a little bit about what you put, since you designed the covers, what you put into this cover, and what you think about when you get into any of these covers. And guys, you're welcome to follow up with any of those questions if you like.
Well, it's hard to, like, when we did the New 70s cover, I wasn't exactly happy with it, because I mean, it did convey the theme of what the New Veiled is, but it didn't really reflect the 70s as much as I wanted it to, and I really wanted this cover to be an 80s cover. So this is actually the second or third 80s cover that I put together for this book. The first one had more of like a digital kind of
oh yeah, it was like geometric shapes on a
on
a sort of a plane. Yeah,
and then I was messing with like Rubik's cubes and all sorts of, it's just, I'm glad I finally settled on kind of this whole slasher motif for the cover. When I showed you that image, you were like, this is it.
Yes.
So I'm very happy with the way it turned out.
Well, you showed me several that had blades, and we were talking about this earlier, how we had to decide, because you have to make all these subtle decisions, like, can you have blades? Should it have blood on it? Is it like too gross or too off-putting to have blood dripping from the blade, or is just the blade okay? And you know, should you have a figure holding it, or just like in this case, it's a hand? So it's amazing the number of like choices that go into all of this. You know, down to you have to figure out how to come up with a type treatment. In this case, you've got a blade that's sticking down diagonally through this image, so it's difficult to figure out how to get typing on it. And yeah, I thought that came out really well. But all right, The Dead Die Hard, which is like one of the best titles I've ever heard. What's going on with that?
Which is not the original title; it's the better title, though, for sure.
Yes.
Well, you know, Die Hard is obviously, inarguably, the greatest Christmas movie ever made. You know, in the original, there were a bunch of terrorists who took over the building, and they started demanding the release of a bunch of political prisoners as a ruse to cover up a theft of a bunch of bearer bonds in a safe. And so in my story, the terrorists aren't after money. They're after a virus being kept in a lab on the 20th floor.
Mm.
And it's a very highly contagious virus, a very deadly virus. And the hero of my story isn't an everyman off-duty New York City police detective. Instead, in my story, we follow the police detective's wife, the one who works in the building, the one who thinks she knows what's in the lab, and fights to get there first to destroy the virus and save her family and her husband and the world. Except terrorists aren't the only things that are coming after her. So that's kind of my play on how to subvert Die Hard.
I enjoyed a chance actually to spend time with the Bonnie Bedelia character of Die Hard. Like, if you know, because it's such a clever idea. Like, if you're going to, let's spend time with, like, if she were the lead instead of John, like that's a great concept, and you don't miss him. You know, that's the funny thing, is if you're following her, you don't feel as though you should be following him, and that was a neat experiment and rather subversive on your part, come to think of it. And that's pretty good.
I think, you know, if she's married to John McClane, she's got to be his equal in a lot of ways.
Right.
In the book, in the story, she is. So
I love Bonnie Bedelia. That's pretty cool. Thank you very, very much.
Sure.
All right, Katya de Becerra.
Hi, Jason.
Hi, there
Hi,
you
everybody.
are. All right, so tell me about Howl, which I know started, well, I mean, it's a take on both cultishness and community, sort of, you know, I guess I was thinking of The Lottery. It's like The Lottery and American Werewolf. But why don't you tell us about Howl?
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, so hi, everybody from very, very cold Melbourne, freezing here in winter. Yeah, I was so excited when I heard the call for this anthology, and I knew I just had to invite myself to it. So I reached out to Jason, and I immediately had this idea. And one of my absolute favorite movies is An American Werewolf in London, and it's from the 80s, and I was born in the 80s, so I didn't actually watch it. You can guess how old I am. I didn't actually watch the movie when it came out, but I watched it in the 90s. It was one of those inappropriate horror movies that my parents let me watch.
Sure.
So I grew up with it, and it was everything. It was like my first horror experience. It was kind of funny. It was romantic. So it was like a perfect movie. I love it so much. So one thing that I kind of always was thinking about is what was life like in the community, like on this Yorkshire moors where we start the movie, the iconic scene in the pub. And it's kind of like it happens, and then we have the characters move on, and you know, the things occur. It happened in London. And I was always wondering what was life like in this isolated community that is, you know, terrorized by a werewolf.
Yeah.
I wanted to know, what are the customs? What are the rituals? How people live? Why don't they just go somewhere else? So yeah, that's how the story came to be. And after much soul searching about the title, I just settled on Howl. I think, like, we'll howl to the moon. So that was the story. And it was like, and interesting, Jason, I didn't even think about the lottery until you mentioned it. And I was like, that is so, yes, you got it. That's exactly, I think it's like, it's one of those stories that is so like in our blood, that sometimes you do this and you don't realize why. Then it's like, oh yeah, I did write a total remix of American Werewolf in London and Shirley Jackson's The Lottery Story.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I wanted to tie in my story to the kind of the beginning of the American Werewolf in London, when we have the two main characters enter the pub. So all the events precede right that, like literally a day before, and then we go from there.
I really loved that it had such a strong sense of place, and it's funny to hear you say that you were born in the 80s, so you didn't. So American Werewolf would have first popped up when you were quite small. You know,
Yeah.
I actually watched American Werewolf at Incher's house in the 80s, so, and we were not quite small. All right, so that'll tell you a lot about our ages, actually. So. Wow, no, but it was really enjoyable, and yeah, anything that I can say is like the lottery always makes me happy, because there's not enough out there that plays on these curious, I don't know how best to put it, the curious, strange customs of small secluded communities. Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for including my story. I really
Oh
appreciate
well,
it.
thank you for. Well, weren't you were part of Femme Fatales, isn't that right?
Yeah, I was. So I got like an early call to the Thinly Veiled, and I was like, no, I have to be in this one. I have to be 80s. I know I have the idea. So I think I emailed it at the same day. I was like, I hope I'm not too late. And you're like, no, that's okay. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Thank you very, very much. Well, cool. And I don't know what time it is where you are, but wait, what time is it actually?
It's a wonderful morning. It's 10:46 in the morning, so it's perfect time for me. I'm completely awake. I had my coffee, so I'm like semi-conscious right now, but it's really cold. So if I start shivering,
You know, for Rob Nisbet, it's like 1:45 in the morning. So he's
good for you.
All right. Thank you very much, Katya. Henry Herz. So guests for dinner. The funny thing is, this is ostensibly Guests for Dinner is a takeoff on MORK and MINDY, but it's also it's Let the Right One In, isn't it? Or am I just imagining too much? Or is that what
you are not imagining too much? It's I knew I wanted to be part of this anthology, and so it's a horror anthology. So I was like, what would be the opposite of that I could think of from 80s TV? And I thought, oh, MORK and MINDY, what a kind, gentle sitcom.
Yeah.
And then the next thought I had was Let the Right One In, because MORK lives with MINDY, lives in the attic. And I was like, oh, she's his Renfield, she's his thrall. And then from there, I was like, okay, there's that neighbor, Binkley, who's always kind of creepy to me. I was like, I'll make him a creepy character in the story. And then my favorite character of all on the show was one that would get applause from the audience every time he walked on stage, and that's Exodore, that crazy guy. Yeah. So I made my Exodore into a religious fanatic vampire hunter. So all my geography is legit. Because the address of the house that MINDY lived in was known, so there's some stuff going on, and I used I used a real map so that all the directions of what's happening are real. And it was just a riot.
Is it Boulder, Colorado, if I recall? Yeah. I've driven by that place. Anyway, continue. I interrupted you.
And that's it. It was really fun to write, and I won't spoil it. So let's just say, it's fans of this TV show will recognize lots of details that are, some things are changed, right? We changed the names, but the MINDY character drives the same kind of Jeep that the one in the show did, and the geography is the same. And so
I wanted to mention, it's a dark story. It's a dark and very, very nicely layered story. And what's funny is how, as we try to figure out the order that we put these in, yours is quite dark and horrible. Howl has a more, like I said, Jackson-esque kind of feel. And prior to that, Incher's is action, and Alethea's is funny. It's a funny story. And so the great thing is, these are laid out so as you go along, you have a mood, and then ideally you don't follow it with one with exactly the same mood, because you want to kind of mix it up. Sometimes you do. Sometimes you want to get into like when you're laying these out, you want to get into like a long path where you have like several stories that'll follow a similar feel. But so far these are all very distinct from one another. And in fact, distinct next comes Jim Towns. And the funny thing is, Jim, your story is called Helicopter, and it is a parody of 80s action, basically.
Specifically Airwolf.
Yes, so different from everything we've talked about before. So
Good.
it has this sort of muscular, Clancy light sort of feel of like, you're describing the helicopters and describing all the action and everything.
All this military shit in it. I know it's weird that I don't really. I had to look up a lot. Cool, thanks. It's an idea I've been kind of trying to figure out for a while. Like in 2011 or 12, I do a lot of screenplay writing, and I was pitching a script to somebody, and it's a werewolf script, and there's a moment in it where someone screams werewolf, and another character thinks they said airwolf and says airwolf, and there's a moment of confusion. And the person reading the script that I was pitching it to told me that was about the dumbest thing he'd ever read in a script, and no one was going to get it. Wow. And it was just I don't know if that's what kiboshed the whole script, but the script didn't get made in any case. And whenever someone tells me that, I'm like, if someone hates an idea that much, there must be something to it, right? Because it elicited a negative reaction, but it did elicit a reaction. So that was so I shelved away the whole airwolf werewolf thing for a little while. I am weirdly obsessed. I mean, I was born in '74, so I grew up in the '80s, and I watched all these shows. I watched Magnum PI. I love Magnum PI. My mom and I would watch Simon and Simon and Knight Rider and all this stuff. Well, Knight Rider is more my show, but I loved Airwolf, and my mom thought it was the dumbest show ever. And the thing I love about Airwolf mostly is I've tried to explain the plot setup of Airwolf to a couple people who weren't old enough to have watched the show, and aren't really even old enough to have an awareness that there was a show on. And if you try to break down the plot to Airwolf and try and explain the characters, there's the Stringfellow Hawkeye, and he has this magic helicopter type thing that he stole from the government, but they let him use it because his brother was missing in Vietnam, and they look at you like they're absolutely sure you're making this up, because there's no possible way anyone would have ever made a show this zany. It's like a fever dream from the 1980s.
Yeah.
So in a way, and I haven't gone around to sewing this on anything yet, but it's for some reason I found this somewhere and I got it. So one of these days it's going to go on a flight jacket of mine or something. I've gotten lucky enough to meet some people and work with some people that were on the show. I've met PJ Souls, who was on an episode. I've met a few other people. And I don't think I'm telling tales out of school to say that Jan Michael Vincent, the star of the show, had a long-running substance abuse problem. To the point where on the show there were constant problems on the show because he was constantly under the influence of something. And I don't want to make light of that, because obviously we view substance abuse and alcoholism in a different way than we did at the time, as a more clinical way, as a health issue. But the connection I wanted to make is this idea of someone who is in charge of this very dangerous helicopter, who, with all this lethal armament, who the government trusts to go on missions and stuff like that, but has a critical flaw in their personality. And in this case, it's the fact that he's a lycanthrope, that there's a werewolf that they put in charge of flying this incredibly powerful helicopter. And I just thought it's such a, to go back to what my proofreader or whatever my producer said on that one script, it's such a dumb idea that I feel like there has to be some merit in it. And the challenge is to try and pull that idea off and make it seem like it's plausible, like someone would have made that show.
I hadn't actually thought about that. The notion that, in a sense, there's a story behind the story, that Jan Michael Vincent's substance abuse problem in a way was like putting a werewolf at the helm of
well, he's the lead of the show, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
his show practically. He's the star. Someone decided that Donald Belisario decided to make this guy the head of the show. It was Belisario's reaction to in their network's reaction to Knight Rider, right? It was like the one network had a magic car driving around, so they need a magic helicopter, and they're going to top it, right?
Yes.
It's wild. And then the style wise, I approached it like I wanted to channel the idea of some guy in the 80s that that the studio would have hired to just churn out these novelizations of their TV shows. Like, you know, those real cheap paperback versions that some of them are based on episodes, some of them are their own original things. And the idea of this, you read some of these and it's like they were written under duress almost. The deadlines must have been terrible. The money probably wasn't that great. These people were just, you know, chucking them out and stuff like that. So it's not like I tried to write it badly, because I don't think those books are written badly at all, but they do, like I said, they feel like they're written under duress. They were
There's
possibly
economy to them
yes.
and
Possibly
I've written a couple of those in my time.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Possibly in some cases fueled by substances to help someone have to stay up for about 3 days straight to meet a deadline or something. So I wanted it. It's like the show that I'm riffing off of was like I said, sort of a fever dream of the moment of the 1980s, of a very kind of drug fueled machismo kind of era. And I wanted the story that they're writing to kind of, it's like in a narrative way trying to match that vibe of the show and it's like, and not quite pull it off, almost pull it off, but not quite pull it off. And that was the goal.
That's so wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing all that about where this came from. That was,
thanks, man.
Enjoyable.
Thanks, Jason.
It's a fun story. Mr. McDermott, Will, I think you're here. In fact, I know you're here. You were here earlier. So novelty, yours is the only story that we did that was about not a property like with characters and stuff, but a sort of pop culture concept that was just around in the era.
Right.
And that's Cushballs. So tell us about this, about novelty.
So the idea kind of came from when I found out about the anthology. I'm a big toy and game guy, I always have been, and so I just started kind of looking at the toys that had come out in the 80s, and one of them was the Cushball. And my wife and I were just doing some brainstorming on all these items, and the one thing that kind of resonated, and I don't remember, like this always when I brainstorm with my wife, I don't remember which one of us said it, but one of us said, what if a Cushball was a tiny spaceship? And then that just exploded in my head with the possibilities of, okay, so now it's Men in Black, but that's the 90s, but it's Chucky, because this Cushball comes to life and starts chasing the characters around the house. It's just this terror-filled chase through the house with a crazed toy. And so that's kind of the concept. And so then just when I started writing it, the characters kind of started developing, and the backstory of the characters started developing. But the main impetus was, there's this tiny Cushball, it breaks open, there's these dead tiny aliens inside, and there's an automatic defense system that snaps into effect and starts terrorizing them.
I love the dead aliens that reminded me of like just stumbling across the corpses of mice, basically. That like they're these tiny bony, like what a horrible thought, just to come across a crashed alien ship in your garage and the aliens are skeletonized and now their little ship is going to try to kill you.
Right.
That was and it's so silly, and I mean, to me, and it's a different feel from these other ones. Like I said, Henry's story, deeply dark, goes all the way with it. And this is this is a really silly idea, and I love that. It reminds me of the Stephen King story about the wind-up chatterteeth that that attack a person.
Right.
Go ahead and commit to the bit and do the story. Wasn't there, Will, I'm trying to think, you might not remember, but it seems to me there was an Agnes Moorehead episode of The Twilight Zone where she's at her farm and there's a teeny tiny spaceship that is attacked. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, that definitely sounds
It's not,
familiar.
it's not necessary, but I could swear that was the thing. Very cool. I really enjoyed that. That was crazy. So here's what's funny. We take that story, and it is, again, really, I mean, not goofy like, you say goofy and you imagine that it would be poorly done, but it's a funny story. But then we get to immediately, by the way, Alethea said this is like a mixtape, and that's true. It is like a mixtape because you're just constantly trying to either weave a feel through or provide a clash. And so the next thing we had was Bryan Young's late night reruns, and it, once again, just like Henry's story, is dark, dark, dark. So Bryan Young, late night reruns, you talked about this story. I think you maybe read it at StokerCon. So why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I had the hardest time picking. There were so many great things I could pick, and I remember sending you an email saying like, I've got these three ideas, and you should pick because I just can't. And this is the one you picked. But it was me saying like, the imagery of Poltergeist. Like, I didn't watch Poltergeist until I was an adult because the imagery of Carol Ann just sort of reaching up to the TV, like in the dead channel as a kid, like scared the hell out of me. Like, just the image. I didn't realize it was a comedy as a kid, but it just scared the hell out of me. And I was like, what if I mix Poltergeist, but with Nick at Night? And that was the only pitch. That was like the least filled out pitch that I'd sent you of the three I sent you. I think the other one was like, I want to do one where Alf actually gets the cat and it's horrifying to the kids. And the other one was Family Ties, but Alex Keaton is like American Psycho, right? Because he's got that, and those all felt very fleshed out to me. And I was like, Poltergeist and Nick at Night, he's never going to go for it. And that's the one you picked. And this is really what came out. And Nick at Night was so formative to me as a kid. Like, so Poltergeist and the fear of that imagery of the dead television and stuff. And Nick at Night is really where I, like, really, that was were my first steps into horror. I was a little later when I was watching Alfred Hitchcock Presents on Nick at Night, but like Nick at Night was very, very influential in me, like to me, more so than contemporary television in the 80s and 90s. And so putting that in a story of a kid who's already living in a nightmare just seemed to make sense to me. And this story just really kind of came pouring out. I actually wrote that first draft the day after you approved the pitch in one sitting. And I was like, wow, I don't know where the hell that came from, but I'm glad it did.
What, I mean, first of all, by the way, does Nick at Night still exist? Is that a thing that people like? I don't know if people even know it necessarily. But yeah, in the day, like Alfred Hitchcock and so they played stuff from the 50s. It was all black and white stuff, nothing color. They weren't playing Happy Days. It was like literally.
I remember watching like Dennis the Menace.
Yeah.
Dobie Gillis, Donna Reed, stuff like that. And it was like, I don't know why you'd want like an 8-year-old to watch any of that stuff, but I was, because it was great. And then Alfred Hitchcock really that cemented it for me. But I think it still exists. They were doing stuff. Last I heard, like Friends was on it or something.
Yeah, I mean,
which makes me feel old.
Does anybody in the room know if Nick at Night still exists? Like, do they still have a variant of it?
Does Nickelodeon still exist?
Yeah, Nickelodeon does.
Nick,
I have no idea.
Quote unquote Nick still exists. I mean, yeah, because they have all those all those kids sitcoms and stuff like that. So those are things. But I don't know if Nick at Night is a thing.
Yeah, it does. Nick at Night is playing Friends, Mike and Molly, Mom, and Young Sheldon these days.
All right.
Just to make us all feel really old.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is really cool. Bryan, but it's dark. This
Yeah.
story, what I thought was really interesting was that the story goes deep into this kid who is constantly negotiating his own fear of like his dad waking up and his dad abusing him and just all this stuff. And I was wondering how you approached something as goofy as picking up a popular culture thing and also doing this deeply serious subject matter.
I think this deeply serious subject matter is something that's really just close to me generally. I grew up in a house that wasn't too far off of this sort of stuff. So tapping into some of the stuff that made me afraid as a kid.
I'm sorry.
like
I'm sorry to hear that. That sucks.
Oh, no. It's fine now. No, it was just really tapping into some of those things. I mean, this is obviously sort of dialed up to 11, but just those fears where things that would ordinarily be scary feel less scary, or they feel scary for a different reason, if that makes sense. Like the TV turning itself on and people talking to you should be scary, but it felt natural to me to play it off against like, this is only scary in the context of what someone else is going to do to me outside of my control in this way. And I think that that's something, talking to victims of child abuse, that feeling of being out of control and needing to sort of do their best to control the things around them to prevent whatever abuse is happening, is sort of like trauma victims generally. And so that really drove sort of the beating heart of this story as it went. And when I turned it in, I have no idea if it actually feels like, if people actually, I was worried that you were going to reject the story actually, because I was like, I don't know if it feels enough Poltergeist or Nick at Night. It went off into this weird child abuse direction.
The assignment is not that hardcore that it has that you have to like. Mine stays super close to the world of facts of life, right? But you don't have to do that. You can just take it as a spin, so yes, that I mean, Will just did Goofballs, and so yeah. How did it go at StokerCon? Like, did people?
Yeah, no, it went really well. I mean, at StokerCon, the reading time I had only allowed me to read like the last half.
Yeah.
But the audience there was into it, and it felt really good. It felt really good to read. So hopefully I'll be able to read it to more audiences at some point.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Hopefully we can talk more. John, and I want to make sure that I pin you. John Pritchard, you had a story called The Dungeon, or actually, how do you pronounce your story, which is named after, it's supposed to suggest the Keep, and it is the movement of the Keep into the world of the time of the American Revolution.
Yeah, the donjon in French, I suppose. It's a film that I've always been fascinated by, but it's also a very frustrating film because there's so much wrong with it. So I took the idea of the Keep, but I wanted to do something more with it, and also went back to the original novel by F. Paul Wilson.
Mm-hmm. I don't think I've ever read it. I remember him mentioning in an interview with Twilight Zone magazine that there was a connection to the historic Dracula in the original The Keep. But all I know is the movie, really. So yeah. Well, so what goes into trying and go, okay, I'm going to try and put this in the 18th century. What did that turn into when you're trying to create a story that has to have a beginning and a middle and an end? I mean, how did it come about?
Oh, well, I'm very interested in the French Revolution, and also there's a particular aspect of the French Revolution called the War in the Vendée, which was when there's a failed royalist rebellion against the revolution, and that resulted in a civil war and what became a war of extermination against the rebels. So that's a very dramatic setting which I've used in other stories, and that was something I wanted to set a story in here.
That's wonderful. What I love is you've got this obviously well-researched historical era. Actually, the funny thing is, you don't need to actually. I have no idea if it's well-researched. That's the crazy thing. All it needs to do is suggest that it's well-researched. Like, it has to be believable to somebody who knows nothing about it, and so, at least that pays off. And you've got that world of these people during the French Revolution, and then into their lives comes a demon which they happen to sort of unlock in this castle keep. That's yeah, that's very cool. Did you? I'm curious. Is the keep may very well be the most obscure of the properties that we used in this collection, because I don't know if people remember the keep. Actually, I would have people raise their hands. Like, did y'all remember the keep? I'm going to assume that people are.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
actually just watched it for the first time like a month ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's sad that it was as imperfect as it was, but it's still got a lot of really fascinating things. Like, Ian McKellen plays a Jewish person who's been captured by the Nazis, and his role feels very much like it inspired his casting as Magneto. I could be wrong, but it feels like dead on that he's playing a different version of Magneto.
Yeah, and Scott Glenn is in it, and the Scott Glenn character,
Glaken.
Yeah, John, I assume that the Scott Glenn character is the character who kind of becomes the American in your the Donjon, correct?
Yes, something like that.
Yeah.
But he's not a supernatural character in my story. He's just somebody who's cursed with the duty of his family.
Yeah, yeah. Which makes him kind of more like a James Fenimore Cooper kind of hero, which is very cool. A wonderful action, man. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate that, and I think it's a beautiful story. There's wonderful language in there. So okay, well, here's what's wild. So that's French Revolution. You've got this American Revolutionary hero in it, in a castle keep, and then we go from that to an abandoned church in Dennis K. Crosby's Jump, which is as far as you could possibly get in terms of in terms of backgrounds. So Dennis, I'm going to try and switch the pin over to your. So where are you, Dennis?
I am here.
There you are.
There I am. I gotta say, for me, and I've actually said this to a lot of people recently. The '80s, I loved, in terms of the pop culture influences, the television, the movies. For me, it's a Saturday morning cartoons, going to play baseball in the afternoon, coming home after school, watching cartoons, watching great shows at night. I had a hard time choosing which show I was going to use in this. My first thought was actually Knight Rider, and it was I scrapped it because there was already so much done in that, in terms of, there was an evil car, there was an evil twin, there was a big bad truck, there was all kinds of stuff that I couldn't just reuse.
Nobody did Knight Rider, by the way. Dennis,
I'm surprised. I really am surprised. But for me, in the later '80s, 87, I think it was, 21 Jump Street was that show for me that was just, I don't know, it just tapped something in me. It was right around that time that I decided that I was going to actually pursue a career in law enforcement, which I never did. But I'm a teenager watching this show, and I just loved tuning into it every week. And then I thought, what's a better venue for a horror story than the abandoned church that served as their headquarters, especially that first season. After season 2, it got a little bit more like cleaned up. There were more people there, but that first season, at least that first half of this first season, it was just those cops in there, and it was, just dirty and dingy, and perfect setting for something to go wrong.
Yeah. We were tweeting about the story, and Holly Robinson actually retweeted the thing.
I saw that. Yeah.
your story.
I totally fanboyed out. I'm like, oh my gosh, she just retweeted something about a story I wrote. That's very cool.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and your story focuses on her her character. What was the name of it was Huffs, right?
Huffs. She was Judy Hoffs on the show. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, your story sort of focuses on her as she is introduced to the people of this precinct.
Yeah, the show itself starts, Tom Hansen, what's his name? Johnny Depp. He's the star. He's the one that was driving the show originally, and it was about his character joining the unit that was already existing. And I'm like, that's cool, but let's pull that back and maybe let's take it from a female perspective, but also let's add a little twist to it too, and let's get some of those horror elements in there. And I think coming at it from her perspective, and also looking at how we can make this as creepy as possible, but also make people wonder like what's going on, what's really happening in the story. And then I felt like I really wanted to hit that ending right where people are not sure about whether she's alive or dead. I'm not really spoiling anything, but what's really happening, what's going on. And I think I hit it. I wrote that story like in an afternoon. I was supposed to be working and decided not to. So
I love that. We used to. I think I'll take a break actually and ask everybody about your process for writing stories, because I remember when Insher and Julia and I used to have parties where we required people to write a story to come and present. And a lot of times we put off writing the story until literally the afternoon before the party. And is that how short stories get done for you guys? I mean, do you just go, you know what, I'm gonna, or do you do like a few pages every day? I mean, I assume it's not like a novel, right, which can take many months, but how long did it take, like for these stories, how long did it take you to pull these together? You don't all have to share, but if you want to share, I'd love to.
I think about a week.
About a week.
Yeah, that's how most short stories go for me. I get the idea, I'll let it sit for a little bit in my head, and then I'll start writing it. I do most of my writing in the hour before I go to work every morning.
Is that so?
Yeah, and I'm at my desk at 6:30, so I'm up early, and I'll write for an hour, and that's usually about 800-900 words. I'll do that, every morning, and by Friday, usually have the first draft of the story.
Wow, that's the most inspiring thing I've heard in like a month. That you just write for an hour before you go to work and knock out like 900. That's really great.
I've written 5 novels that way.
Well, yeah, if you just keep
if you show up every
words.
day, boom, it's most of my chapters are about 900 words since I write thrillers. So you just keep doing it till you got 60,000 and you're done.
That's really great. Does anybody else have anything that they would add to that?
I could add that. I mean, for me, sorry, Dylan, do you want to go?
Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, just briefly. I think for every story it's different. For me, for this one, I kind of was in a state of possession. I just wrote it so quickly. I think I pitched it to you, Jason, got like green light, like, yeah, that sounds good. And then I went and wrote it over a couple of days, and then I kind of let it sit, and then I revised. But the gist of it, like the story was drafted very quickly, because sometimes you just know what you want it to be, how you want it to end, and then you just find time and write it. And I'm lucky to have a fairly flexible job. I work at the university, so I kind of do my own thing, and I can just write if I want to, as long as I do my actual job as well.
Yeah, and who's to know, really? So that's great. Thank you very much. Jeremiah, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say I usually draft the story. I try to draft the story in one sitting. I aim for 3,000 words, and I think that's pretty doable in one sitting, especially on like a Saturday. Usually
Wow.
they go over. They go to 4
For
or 5,000.
you, maybe. Yeah. I mean, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, that's fine. Yeah. So that's just my process. I usually try to draft that big chunk in one day, and it feels like that's the big task. And then editing is like the thing I do over the course of days. So
I wrote mine in one sitting too. It took about, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours in one sitting. And I mean, mine's, I think, about 5,000 words, and that's about 1,000 words an hour. But I try to do them in one sitting if I can, but it's usually a few sittings over 2 or 3 days. And this one just wouldn't let me go. So
Wow.
it just came out all at once. And I was sitting at a coffee shop doing it. And so I drank, maybe the coffee had something to do with that.
That's wonderful. I love that. I miss working in coffee shops. I haven't done that in a while. My favorite place to work, when I used to work in the evening, was to go to a lecture hall at the University of Denver. And but ever since COVID, I haven't really done that. And I've switched over to working in the morning, kind of like Charles. So I do miss doing the coffee shop thing, though. That's really interesting. I'm fascinated by how many of you will just sit down and try to do the whole story in one sitting. That's interesting. And I also wonder, we can't address this right now, but I also wonder if that affects the way the story is constructed. Like, in other words, if a story that is done in one setting might tend to have fewer scenes but longer scenes, or something like that. Jeremiah, you were just talking about how you knocked this out, and the interesting thing about Notes from Project Cyber Police is it is a series of it's the funniest thing I've ever read. It's a series of like 80s style what would you call them, like missives, memos. They're memoranda being written by these executive assistants.
Yeah, basically, I work a corporate job, and I have been in big agency meetings where I get tasked with taking notes, which sucks. It's like the worst job to have. You have to listen to what everybody says, and occasionally it's kind of crazy. Someone will turn to you and say, "This is off the record," and you will have to not take that note, although you will always take the note, and then you just keep it out of the permanent record, keep it for yourself, just in case you ever need some dirt. You have it. But so I didn't want to let that go, that experience. I don't do it anymore, the note taking. So I didn't want to let that go to waste. So I just drew on that for this story, and I decided to do, I started thinking about like what corporation could I do this with, and it was OCP from ROBOCOP, essentially a different, a thinly veiled version.
Yes.
And their notes are about their project Cyber Police, which is essentially like the ROBOCOP program. And then as I was writing this story, it grew kind of beyond a pastiche. It started as sort of a pastiche of RoboCop was the idea, and then there's so many things in the 80s I love. I was actually born in '91, but I grew up on 80s films essentially. So I just wanted to throw in as many like 80s references as I could. So it's in a city that's really kind of evocative of John Carpenter's Escape from New York. There are references to basically the way they get their RoboCop to work is they use reanimator fluid. So if you've seen Reanimator from the 80s, that's that, and H.P. Lovecraft. It obviously is connected to Reanimator fluid.
The connection to Reanimator was a surprise to me.
Yeah.
It was like, so it's RoboCop and Reanimator.
Yeah, and it completely organic. I was just writing the story, and I was like, what would be something fun to tie in here, and what could actually make that work? And I was like, and that actually created a funny Cujo reference too, because they were talking about prior tests with the fluid, the reanimator fluid that went wrong, and one of them was a Cujo-like dog. So lots of references, and then the story itself has all the names in it are pulled from RoboCop in some way, shape, or form. So there's a lot, like the character in RoboCop who is one of the news anchors is like in charge of like spin for the company. That kind of like those kind of references. And before I finish, I do have to thank my grandmother. She's dearly departed. She passed when I was 9, but she, for some reason, before I was the age of 9, I must have been between 5 and 9 somewhere. She let me watch RoboCop. I have no idea why. I was way too young for it, but I've loved the movie ever since. And so it felt really cool to get to work on this story drawing on my love of RoboCop, because I think it's like one of the best films ever made. It's a complete masterpiece. So it's fun to take it and spin with it. You know, do something new with it. So.
I first of all, by the way, I should say, by the way, congratulations, because Jeremiah just had a child born in the last few days.
Yep.
So he's taking time out of his his schedule to be here on a Zoom call. I can't imagine how much sleep you must be losing. But congratulations again. Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's so fantastic. RoboCop, I just want to mention for Julia, who is controlling, you know, letting people into the room and so forth. RoboCop was literally our first date. Like you know, it's like, hey, would you like to go? At the time, you did this by walking up to a person and speaking to them with your mouth. So I would say, hey, would you like to go on a date? And somehow she said yes, and we went to see RoboCop, which is like literally a movie that was so violent that it was nearly rated X, so
probably should have been, based on that. The scene that always gets me is when Alex Murphy gets murdered. That is, just it's so brutal to watch, because they really put a lot of thought and focus into making sure you knew he was suffering from those injuries. There was no Hollywoodizing.
Oh my God. Yeah, that was a terrible choice. Terrible choice. Anyway, but good choice for you. Terrible choice as a first date. But thank you so much. Is that, by the way, is that an X-Men 97 shirt that you're wearing?
This is Dark Phoenix Saga. You know, classic cover from.
No, for sure. I want that shirt. That's,
yeah, I love it. It's a favorite. And before I go, I do have to add that if we get to Thinly Veiled 90s, maybe I'll do a third story about Independence Day, because this story, Notes from Project Cyber Police, serves as a pseudo sequel to my story in 70s Thinly Veiled, which was the Blood Ink comic book. So, and that was kind of an organic thing that grew up as I was writing this. I was like, oh, this is about a New York City that's gotten corrupt. What could have corrupted it? And if you want to find out, you can read my previous story. You don't need to read it to enjoy this one, but it's there if you want to. So hopefully I'll get the chance to complete the trilogy.
We haven't figured out yet whether it'll be the 90s or something else entirely. You know, and
90s is pretty great.
We'll get to the 90s eventually.
Yeah, we're definitely going to do the 90s.
But I don't think we're going to go much further than that.
Yeah, I agree. You want to keep it like separated by at least some time, so that because I'd be less interested in something from like 2010 and beyond. So yes. All right. So Mr. Nisbet, you know, just like you have a wedding and you always want to call attention to the person who has traveled the farthest. You've traveled the farthest in terms, at least, of time zones to be with us. And your story is called Do Androids Dream? And it's actually a spin, you flagrantly called it Do Androids Dream, as in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And it's a spin on Blade Runner. Why don't you tell us about it?
Yes, well, obviously Do Androids Dream is a riff on Blade Runner, the Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, but it's also part of the story. So Do Androids Dream, there's a scene in the Blade Runner film near the end where Roy is dying on the top of a roof in the rain. He has this wonderful speech about attack ships on the shoulder of Orion and sea beams glittering over the Tannhauser Gate. And he sort of thinks to himself that all those memories will be lost. But what if they're not? And the idea of the story, there's lots of sort of gory horror in the story itself, but the real horror is that Roy's eyes, which have seen all these sights, are reused and they're implanted into someone else. So these eyes sort of drill back into the brain of their new host, and the memories that would have been lost actually affect the dreams of the person who has the eyes. That just happens to be what I call Decker, the replicant from the film, which was Deckard. And the horror of it is that, yes, androids do dream, but in this case, the dreams are prompted by the eyes which have been inserted into it.
That's so amazing, especially since you have that line in the original Blade Runner where Roy says to the professor, he says, "If you could imagine what I have seen with your eyes," you know, meaning the eyes that you created, and so it's such a great concept to just continue that. Your story, I think, is the one that out of all of them is the closest to the source material. You know what I mean? It feels very much like it could very well be a fic in the world of that, you know, with and that was cool because it's cool to see that some of them veer sort of crazily in a different direction, and yours just sort of builds on it.
Yeah, that was deliberate. My story starts where the film of Blade Runner ends. The director's cut, not the one with all the nice green hills at the end of it. It's not that one. So it starts with Decker and Rachel in the flat, the apartment. They are leaving. Decker has just realized, because of an origami figure, that he himself is the replicant. And yeah, so that's quite a stunning place to start. So my story starts immediately after that. They escape and then terrible things happen, and he ends up with this eye from Rory, or Roy from the film.
Yeah.
It was a help to just start with the film and carry on from that point, because I think the film is so unique, so visual, that it helped with my descriptions. I just needed to describe a little bit of what I wanted it to be. And then anyone who's seen the film will just recognize it and build up this little world in their head, because it's the same world.
Absolutely. Yeah. I thought it was very effective that way. And it just sort of makes me feel good that those are the different ways that you could go. You could either make it so I'm in this world and I know this world, or I am very different from the world and I'm just making references to it, such as in the Donjon, which you know is the story of the keep and the concept of the keep, but in the 18th century. And so that thank you very much, Rob. And by the way, once again, not only thank you for being here tonight, but thank you for being here so many times. I've really enjoyed doing this, and you always being on the other side of the freaking planet. So that's really
I've enjoyed it too. By the way, it's available in England.
Oh my goodness, looky there. I do not have my copies. That is wonderful. I don't have my copies. My copies are in a box that's actually headed for Anime Fest, which is where I'm going to be at the end of the month. And so I went ahead and just had them shipped there so that I can have them up at my booth and stuff. So I should say our booth, Incher's in my booth. Julia's going to be with me. So I think Incher, I think you're going to be with us in spirit, but you made the banner, so it's our booth. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Nisbet. Heath, thank you for your patience, Heath Shelby. So you did a story that is, once again, just like the look at the koosh ball, is difficult to describe in how odd a choice this is. And it is, what if Alf were a Bigfoot? So tell me about Lifeform.
Well, first off, let me say thank you to our beloved publishers for continuing this thinly veiled series. I mean, the 80s, I mean, the pop culture, the music, the clothing, and I mean, in my heart, the music, I still live in the 80s. So, and the cover is also makes a great screensaver, if you can see that, if you can or not. But yeah, Lifeform, I had unfinished business with thinly veiled 1970s. I wrote a story in that one simply called Falk, and it was about the Boggy Creek Monster, which is a Bigfoot. And there's actual, what they call real life sightings of what they have a smaller Bigfoot that's like 3 foot tall, 4 foot tall, that they claim is not a juvenile. They claim that it's just a different species. So I've always kind of wondered, you know, wouldn't that be kind of cool if it was an alien and a Bigfoot, because the $6 Million Man led us to believe the Bionic Bigfoot was an alien. So why not combine those two? And that's what I did.
I were you part of the world that, I mean, I know you were, but I'm wondering if you were as profoundly affected by stories about Bigfoot as I was when I was a kid. It seems
Oh,
to me
absolutely.
like everybody was talking about Bigfoot like all the time in the late 70s.
My turning point was not the Legend of Moggy Creek. I didn't see that till the 80s. The movie that affected me was a movie called Sasquatch. Came out, I think, 77.
Yeah.
It was filmed like a documentary, and at that time we thought it was real. So yeah, I was hooked on Bigfoot from that point on.
Wow. I remember seeing some movie that I've watched recently, and it's just astonishingly bad and cheap. You know, something that they started filming in like 68, and then they finished filming in like 72, and they got some more money. It was called like The Revenge of Bigfoot or something. And but we would watch anything. Boggy Creek, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's wonderful. Alf, you know, and the funny thing is you've juxtaposed Bigfoot with Alf, which is one of the goofiest concepts that ever came to TV, which is there's a puppet alien living with a family. And I you know, that is such, and what I love the most is you play it straight. You just like, you know, it's like, let's just pretend it wasn't a sitcom. We're going to play this. This is, again, just like Henry's concept of let's take Mork and Mindy and make it super dark. You know, it's like, let's take Alf and make it into a conspiracy Bigfoot story. That was really cool.
Alf was probably my favorite sitcom back in the 80s. My best friend Misty and I would watch this on Monday night and talk about it for 6 days until the new episode. So I was really big on Alf back in the day, and I always want to see him catch that cat, and he never did. So in this story, I made sure he caught a cat.
Oh my gosh, that's really cool. And you've actually got a lot of your friends who've actually already gotten the book and sent you reviews. So I think
absolutely.
That's really cool. That's neat. Thank you, Heath, very much. Gosh, actually, that brings us there's only one more story, which was actually my story. And I'll do this real quick because I don't want to like belabor my time. I guess I'll move the pen to myself. But all right, my story is called Floodwater, and I always had a favorite episode of Facts of Life, which is where at the School of Facts of Life, they're threatened by a flash flood, and everybody's sort of out of character because they're laying sandbags and they're getting ready for this flood that's going to overtake the school. And I was fascinated by that, and I was like, well, what if it's the flood of Facts of Life, but you have Blair and Joe. Joe was not a character in the original version because she only came along in later seasons of the show. But let's assume that you had Blair and Joe, and they have broken off on their own to deal with this flood, and then there's a serial killer. And I loved this thing. I actually used a hardcore outline for this. I outlined it like a novel and just made the chapters short. And so it's you know, it's 8,000 words long, and I did it exactly like I'd write a novel, and therefore I wrote like a little bit every day, and it took me about a week, I suppose, to pull together. So yeah, mine's Facts of Life. But you know, while I have everyone, and I appreciate your patience in going through all of that, I was curious if anybody wanted to ask a question based on what you've been hearing, or that anything that's made you think about, or from the room, ask a question, because we have everyone here. I would love to just have that element of unpredictability. Joya, are there any questions anywhere? And if not, if you have one, that's great.
I don't know if you can hear me because I have my microphone. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. You're a little dim, but
yeah, the microphone on my computer is not good. I didn't see any questions, but feel free to put some in the chat if you have them. I had thought of a story but didn't make it happen based on Heart to Heart, so maybe someday. Yeah. But I would just like to know, of the people who don't remember the 80s, what was it like to go to the 80s?
Yeah, okay. All right, good question. For those of you who are too young to remember the 80s, what was it like to place something in the 80s? I guess it would be like Well, no, you tell me without me putting words in your mouth. Like what was that like writing in this historical era that you don't have a personal memory of?
Am I the only one that wasn't alive for the 80s? Is that is that the case?
I don't know. Actually, that might be the case. It might be the case. So in which case the question is yours.
I just grew up on so much like 80s pop culture that I felt like I kind of had lived there. And then growing up in the 90s wasn't like, it was different from the 80s, but it wasn't that different in some ways in terms of like being a kid. Like the internet didn't get big until the late 90s, and at least my family never really had enough so that the internet was readily accessible. Like I didn't start getting online until the early 2000s. So to me, growing up in the 90s felt like what I saw in the 80s. It was, going outside, and occasionally I had maybe better video games. I had PlayStation instead of Nintendo, but that was like the only real difference as a kid, but I guess the fashion was different, obviously. But the interesting thing is, like, me and my wife talk about this a lot, the decades 70s, 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, there's always a little bleed. So like the early 80s looks like the late 70s, and the early 90s looks like the late 80s. So like my mom, like when I was a kid, she still kind of had big hair for a while because it hadn't kind of phased out yet. So I don't know. So I guess I don't know. Like I said, I think I absorbed it through osmosis.
I mean, one of the great things, like if you look at like Stranger Things, one of the things they get right is that the houses, for the rich families, the houses look, super swank and have wallpaper or paint, colorful paint. But if for the families that don't have enough money to have renewed their houses still look like anything from the late 60s to the late 70s with all that wood paneling, which somebody thought was gorgeous at some point. But let me tell you, that stuff sucks the light out of a house like you wouldn't believe. It is so bizarre how much you can kill the light in your house with that stupid wood paneling. And yes,
my office, the blue right behind here, that's actually painted wood paneling, because when I bought this house, this whole office was wood paneling, and we wanted to rip it out and replace it, but that's so expensive. So we filled in the cracks with putty and painted it to make it look like it wasn't wood paneling. Yeah, wood paneling is horrible.
I mean, certain wood paneling is great, but boy, the really dark one, I guess you have to be very careful with it because, again, it's just so dark. I mean, and that was super popular. Yeah, I think in terms of how life was, because I had to write this story that takes place in the 80s, and how life was so analog. Like if you need to get back to school because you got to like clear out your room because there's a flood going on, you don't have a cell phone. There's no actual means of anybody getting in touch with you. So Julia, was there something else that you wanted to add to that? I only asked because the focus went to you for a second, so I thought you had said something. I'm sorry.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I'm curious because I know when we did the 70s last year, I did mine based on Sanford and Son, and I started rewatching the show.
Yeah.
I did it again with 21 Jump Street. I'm curious if anyone else got like really geeky about me. If you wrote about a show, did you start like rewatching episodes and trying to kind of get caught up and get back into that feel of it again?
Did anybody?
I very much did. Yeah, I watched about 20 Magnum PI episodes back to back.
Nice.
Which I
never
enjoyed.
quit watching.
No, that was me. I've watched it since it was on. Watched it. When I was homesick or something, it used to always be on in the daytime, so I would watch it. But yeah, no, I pretty much steeped myself in the Magnum. But it was kind of funny. Something I had noted. Henry was talking about when he was writing about MORK and how he was we both were writing about fictional versions of someplace, but we got out maps and things and checked the real locations, which I thought was kind of funny.
Wow. No, so did you, I'm actually real curious where you found this stuff, because yeah, you're right. They used to play Magnum at like 2 in the afternoon. Now you can, I don't know if it's on Paramount or Tubi or something.
It's streaming on Tubi or one of the free services, so you have to watch a couple of commercials. But hey, I grew up with commercials, so that's
Right.
not really
Right.
a big deal for me. So yeah, but it was, it didn't cost me anything, and I tended to pick episodes I remembered really enjoying. One of my favorites being the one that has Frank Sinatra on it. So
Yeah.
that's a really good episode. And then, the one with Mako as the samurai, the arrow that is not aimed, and it was kind of fun. But yeah, no, I definitely watched a lot of the show.
Dennis, where did you watch 21 Jump Street? Is it on Tubi?
It is currently on Peacock.
Oh, it's on Peacock.
Yeah,
Oh.
so it's that's on there, and the spinoff Booker was on there. So I was surely going down this nostalgic road. But yeah, it's on Peacock right now. It might also be on Tubi as well, but
it might be. I watched it the other day with commercials on just one of the free advertising supported television. What we now call FAST, free advertising supported television. I watched it on one of those the other day. That's a good question. Yeah, I did not dive deep into Facts of Life. I don't even think it's available. If it is, I have not found it. But I did watch this one on a bootleg. I found somebody who had posted it somewhere. So the one about the flood, I was able to rewatch.
Apparently, it's free on Pluto TV.
Facts of Life is free on Pluto.
That's what the internet is telling me.
Goodness gracious! Wow, so many missed opportunities. All right, well, Julia, we're gonna watch some Facts of Life. So that'll be great. Gosh. So I know that we're way over time, but I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining us to talk about Thinly Veiled 80s. I hope you hear from people about it. I really am very excited about this series, and Intro and I just really love all of you for taking part in this, and it's a dream to continue publishing with all of you. And thank you so much. And I can't wait to do it again. I can't wait to see what comes next. So, everyone be kind to one another, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Thanks so much, Jason.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.